Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Rich. I am Ellen Ardrey. I am the Associate Director for Support at NGA. And in a former life, I was also NGA's Chief Human Capital Officer. And so I've been spending a little bit of time thinking about the kind of skills we're going to need in a workforce for the future. And some of those we're going to hire, and some we're going to train. And so the panel today is about what it's going to take to skill a workforce in an environment that is changing so rapidly. And we're going to think about it a little differently, and you can see the title of this panel is Beyond Training, and this is really about knowledge and skill transfer in the future. So for those of you who were here yesterday for GEOINT Forward and had a chance to see Todd Boccastow's presentation, if you liked it, you're going to love this panel, because I will tell you, I am joined by 4 professionals who see the world very much like Dr. Boccastow. And they've thought very deeply about this. And I'm going to turn it over to them in just a minute, but I wanted to introduce your panelists for this afternoon. So first of all, on my far right, your left, Dan Scott. He's the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence College. For Dan, Tampa is coming home. In a former life, he was both the director of targeting and also the deputy J2 at CENTCOM. And if you catch him after this, he might have some good restaurant recommendations. So Dan Scott, great to have him here. Next to him, we have Colin Agee. Colin is the co-chair of the GEOCOM Training and Education Council, the subpanel, and also the Army DCPDS. It's a little known fact that Colin is also an NCAA baseball umpire. So I'm going to count on you, Colin, to field any curveballs from the audience, all right? There you go. Next to Colin, we have Eric Kleinsmith. Eric comes to us from the American Military University, and he's in the School of Continuing and Professional Studies. A little known fact about Eric is that he was in the investigative team that has discovered the true identity of D.B. Cooper. So for those of you from the 1971 Boeing hijacking, catch Eric after this for his story. But I love having not only the federal government, but also academia. And that brings us then to the third segment, which is Julia Bowers. She is the CEO of Pearl Analytics. She hails from South Carolina. And down there, she applies human geography and the work that she's done over the years with human geography with the commercial market. She's a self-proclaimed workaholic, but she also has 2 dogs and enjoys gardening. So glad to have Julia here representing the industry segment. So a little bit of a preamble to set up the panel. Advances in geospatial applications and tradecraft are outpacing our ability to deliver professionals with the skills and knowledge to work in this evolving industry and mission space. No single segment, academia, industry, or government, can possibly fulfill the knowledge and skill transfer needs alone. We need to work collaboratively and recognize and leverage each of our competitive advantages. We need to think beyond traditional training and instead think about different ways to accomplish knowledge and skills transfer. And with that set up, I'm going to turn to Dan Scott and ask you for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Ellen. I just want to make a few points briefly this afternoon. First, as the director of the college with an agency of about 8,300 employees and also responsibility for some training for the enterprise, I'd like to emphasize that in the future it's really about lifelong learning. It'll be very, very important that everyone, whether you're an analyst or a financial analyst or a human relations specialist, you're going to have to retool yourself several times during a 30 or 40-year career. Keep in mind that about 60% of the jobs that will exist in 10 years do not even exist today. So the new technologies will be created. People have to learn to use those technologies and do those new functions, and we'll have to retrain the existing workforce to do so. In order to get there, we're going to have to learn and practice more sharing and collaboration of our training. No one institution, whether it's Penn State or a military academy or the National Geospatial-Intelligence College, can ever hope to take on all those tasks and keep all that knowledge up to base, as well as train into the new fields of knowledge that are required. So we'll have to be very, very careful about ensuring that we share and collaborate to raise the skills of everyone in the enterprise. Secondly, training must be delivered faster, better, and cheaper. I know that's kind of an oxymoron. In my basic Python coding, the Boolean expression of faster plus better plus cheaper is always equal to false just can no longer be true. We have to change that law of physics. We literally have to make training cheaper and faster and better to deliver. The way we can do that is to, one, share and collaborate. Two, we have to innovate as much as possible in training and in how we design the systems. And three, we need to change our expectations about our own adult learners. Oftentimes, we have them go through just what is a plodding training regimen, when in fact, they're already well beyond that when they're coming out of the schools of being taught by people like Todd Backistow. We need to take advantage that this generation is really the next best generation and shoot them forward instead of holding them back. Finally, in terms of artificial intelligence, everyone talks about, hey, we have to think about artificial intelligence, how we use it. I would argue that we already do so, and I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to talk to you about how that will change a little bit. But every one of us learned to drive somewhere between the age of 15 and 16. This was really a man or woman machine interface that you were taught by your parent, and then depending on your state, you may have had to have 50 hours of training before they gave you a license. That 50 hours is designed to, one, give you experience with the technology, and two, to develop your judgment to make sure that you were going to drive okay. Over the years, we had to improve car technology to make sure that that man-machine interface was a little better than in the past, in the previous years. As a result, death rates have declined. But if you take that high school graduate, you send them to college, and then you decide to make them a jet pilot, they just don't jump in a jet. Now we have at least a year of training, a year more of schooling in order for them to better understand the machine that they're operating, to understand those performance parameters. And then you're counting on them to improve their judgment and to be able to operate in a 3D, very fast-paced environment. If you go from there to flying a space shuttle or a rocket into space to join the International Space Station, it's even more time and training, more background into understanding the parameters of the machine that you have. So when we're looking at AI in the GEOINT in the future, we need to make sure that we design, just like we do the car and the dashboard, as the same as a cockpit in a jet or the control system in a nuclear operations center. We design that to communicate with the human in the way that the human can interpret it very quickly and understand that the machine is operating correctly or if there's something wrong. In addition, we need to make sure that we can train or put training into the design of the technology so that when the technology is built, the whole concept of human factor design is put into play. And finally, although I wish I had, several years to train people, I know that I don't. So we're really going to get maybe days at a time. If we're lucky, we'll get 2 or 3 months to train people up in new technologies. But really, we need that training and that design to come in so I can get people offline and within a few days get them back online and producing. With that, Ellen, I'll turn it over to Colin.
Okay, so I guess it would be considered bad form to rat out your fellow panel members right at the beginning here, but I don't know if you know the procedure. They give us a safety briefing before we come up here. The first rule is don't drink and brief. And you know, Julia, just as we're walking up here on the stage, Julia says, "Hey, you guys, there's margaritas over there," and so it's too late.
Cheers.
So if it sounds like we're talking fast, that's where we're going. And if you have questions, we'll be at the bar right after this. So I'm the Army guy at NGA. I'm part of the Army Geospatial Office. Some of my team is here in the audience. The Army guy is on this panel because, as was mentioned, Dan and I are co-chairs of the Geospatial Training and Professional Development Subcommittee, which is subordinate to the National System for Geospatial, a subcommittee of the GEOCOM. So what I'm going to do really quickly is, in 1 minute each, I'm going to talk about what we did last year, what we're focused on this year, and then the meat of it, I'm going to plagiarize the hell out of Todd's briefing, who seems to be in absentia the star of this briefing, but for good reason, I think, and you'll see why. So last year, our committee, some of the things we did, we published an NSG Analytic Modernization Training Roadmap. If you listen to the plenary session this morning, you know Robert made an announcement about that, and I'll highlight that when I talk about this year. Certification, if there was one thing that we focused on last year, that's what it was. The program's been going about 3 years now. We hit the 10,000 mark last year, and that's across the whole enterprise, so that is not a trivial thing. We accredited 7 new GEOINT certifications. As the level of complexity and the seniority goes up, the difficulty of those certifications becomes more difficult, so that was a good accomplishment. And you would think this would be kind of pro forma, but the services identifying the positions that are subject to certification became somewhat contentious, and so we wrestled with that issue. And I'm seeing smiles from the guys that work on our committee. They know exactly what I'm talking about. Broader than that, doing cooperative learning. The UK opened up their Royal School of Military Survey to NSG members, so the first time, and we're going to announce the people who will be going this year very soon. The Marine Corps opened a course that they call GOLF, GEOINT Online Fundamentals. The Army just had several dozen people, to include from the Army Geospatial Battalion, be the beneficiaries of that course. And the ASG, the Allied System for Geospatial, and we just had the Australians here, they opened up some of their training to us as well. So we're getting a little more expansive, still have work to do. In 88, we're going to be, or 18 rather, we're going to be looking at developing common standards for training, tradecraft, and professional development. We're going to accelerate the learning environment. Some of the things that Todd recommended, online web-based training, virtual classrooms, distributed learning, so being able to do more than just in the classroom. Now, I mentioned that Robert made an announcement this morning, and that was that next year, or in the next 3 years, all analysts will train on computational thinking and data analytics. And so that is part of the larger increase of AMOD into the curriculum. And then finally, we'll be expanding certification. Now, to get into the good part, this is, a couple weeks ago, we had an event out at the Mace called GEOINT Enterprise 2025. Our featured speaker for training was Dr. Bacasto from Penn State. I'm going to compress his 46 pages into the next 2 minutes. If you attended the plenary session at GEOINT Forward, you heard a compressed version. But I'm plagiarizing this because I think it's really good. And here's some of the things that he commended to us. Get back to the basics. We're finding that geospatial professionals are all into the applications and about jumping in and doing things, but they don't really understand the big picture of what they're doing and why they're doing it. This leads into his next one, mastery learning, which true mastery can be up to a decade, but that should be the ultimate goal. And again, I don't have time to go into all of what goes into that. One that is really intriguing to me, human-machine teaming. You know, we have a tendency to think of this false dichotomy of man versus machine. It's not. It's the two of them working synergistically, and that means this panel, they've got to train together. And guess what? If you have AI and machine learning and the machines are learning, the machines are going to be trained with the humans. I think that's a little different than the experience of all of us. Todd talked about anticipating human behavior through the lens of time, physical, and cultural geographies. So anticipatory intel, the topic of another briefing earlier today, that contributes to that. And then Several things, I'm just going to list these off, don't have time to elaborate, but grouped under accelerated learning: gamification, simulation, immersion, intelligent tutoring, adaptive learning. One that really intrigues me: rapid ingest of lessons from the field. You know, a lot of times we think the classroom has to tell people what to do in the field, but are we working at the other direction and changing what we teach based on what's really going on in the field? And then the last thing, the synergy, and this has been a theme, I think, throughout this GEOINT, between government, academia, and industry. And I'll turn it over to Eric.
Well, I'm glad they're actually serving alcohol, because a lot of this makes more sense now than it would if we had briefed it in the morning. But yes, I take a look at the same topic from an education standpoint, but I was also a program manager for training for Army INSCOM for about 13 years of a program that in the later years became known as Foundry. And that was a huge learning curve, not only for the instructors that we would hire, and I worked for a very small business called Lockheed Martin at the time, but not only training the instructors, but then also training the customer as a government customer on what actually our purpose was. And I've had a government customer, and I won't mention any names, but the agency he was from, his initials are DIA. And he said, look, I don't care about what you're doing with this analytical stuff. I just want you to train the analysts on the tool and then plug them into the machine. And I absolutely refuse to do that. It belied the entire purpose of why we are here as trainers and instructors, and that's been found out by additional things that I've done and experienced over the years, training and then getting into education. So to back up a little bit, then again, is where are we getting our intelligence professionals from? And every time I have somebody come up and ask me, well, how do I get into intelligence as a career? First thing I tell them is go do something else first, because where does intelligence get their people from? Is we steal them. We steal them from the military, because that's free training for the contractor standpoint or anywhere else. We take them from law enforcement. We do take them from colleges and universities, but that's very small and not enough to sustain a $60 billion a year industry with tens of thousands of people at every single agency. And then you also take them from other professions, whether it's finance, whether it's IT, whether it's legal or psychology, sociology. We take them from anywhere, but we take them from somewhere else. And so to bring those folks into our profession, we have to convert them into intelligence professionals. And how do we do that? Well, we do it through training, and we do it through education to a degree. But then you look out at what's available in the entire landscape, and there's only very few opportunities for training to get new folks into the industry. So for an accessions profession, we do a horrible job at making a standard practice of bringing in intelligence professionals other than OJT, or we're going to train you while you're here in the job, or something like that. So you have the intelligence community schoolhouses, which do a fantastic job, except that they're very limited in the scope and the amount of people that they can provide training for every year. There's nowhere near they can cover the entire agency, plus the 70% of their workforce that are contractors. So then you turn to professional organizations like USGIF. They are out there. And then you have your large business providers, like I mentioned, like Northrop Grumman and these huge defense integrators, but then you add to that some of the small boutique providers that they're experts in a specific given area, and they're world class, but again, they're expert in a specific given area, not in the depth and breadth of everything. And the last thing you turn to is the education realm. And you look at the colleges and universities that actually offer intelligence as a degree, and they're very few and far between. And so it's really not enough to sustain. And so as we look at that, the last thing I'd ask you to look at is, once we've done the initial training, we are only addressing, initial training through formalized programs, we're only addressing 2 moments of learning need. And if you have time after this or sometime during the work, I'd urge you, please go out and check out what the 9 moments of learning need are. It used to be 5, but somebody really got smart and said, no, there's really 9, and they added to it. So the 9 moments of learning need, of which 2 of them are when you are experiencing something new and when you want to learn something more. And that's where all the structured training that we now have available addresses. But then there's another piece right after that. Well, what about training and education and learning the moment when you need to remember something? And that's where your DITEB comes in with all the certifications and the 11 different geospatial certifications and the 27 other different certifications that are now floating around Department of Defense. What has happened with the IT community, if you know the Army Regulation 8140 and 8570, it's exactly the direction that the DoD community is going into with training and certification. So that's just going to cover that piece. But now these other moments are out there, and we just don't have a way to cover them through formal training. When something changes, when you experience a problem, when you want to solve a differences in your organization, or when you want to teach yourself, our community does not adequately address that. So the intelligence analyst and the professional is largely on their own for a lot of these different areas to go get their own training, do their own case studies, and then again do it on their own time. So those are questions. I'm not giving you any answers out. I'm just stating here's the problem. We got to figure out where our intelligence analysts are coming from. We have to figure out how we're going to get them into the environment, and once they are in the environment, how do we sustain and improve their workforce during the entire length? And we are not set up to do all of those three.
Thanks, sir. Bring us home.
Maybe some of the comments that I'll say today will help us set up for that. So I look a little bit different than my panel members. I'm an industry person, not a government person. I'm very passionate about looking at pattern analysis. I'm also a spatial thinker. Here on this panel, I'm going to talk to you about a framework that I put together that we use in industry, or I use in industry, and you probably use too, but you don't realize that you use it. My background is in human geography and social science research. I've worked for several defense companies. Some of them have booths here today. And right now I'm independent and an independent thinker. I'm mostly passionate about qualitative data, but I'm more passionate about quantifying the qualitative data. I like to turn feelings into thoughts, and I like to make the unconscious conscious. There's reasons why you like someone and why you don't like someone, but you may not understand and know those reasons. And what I spend my time doing is I try to figure out what those observables might be, and I think about it. And so you can imagine why human geography and social science research might be interesting to me. This applies to training. The name of our panel today is From Training to Knowledge Transfer. So let's frame that. Training to me is direct and structured, and it's scheduled and it's uncomfortable. Knowledge transfer for me is indirect. It's a conversation, it's unstructured, it's intimate, and it's passive. I think that knowledge transfer is far superior to training since it is customized to the audience, it's inspiring, and it draws on intrinsic motivation. I think training really needs a makeover. So I'm a spatial thinker, as most of you probably are. You're here at a conference supporting NGA, and we make maps. As a spatial thinker, one thing that I do is when I meet somebody, I draw a box around them in my brain. And as they talk, I fill the box up with details. And I don't know if anyone else does this, but this is how I catalog and I process information. What I'd like to do today is I'd like to draw a box around training. And the approach that I want to use is very simple. It's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 has to do with the 5 senses. This is going to sound very simple, but you often overlook this. The 5 senses are sight, sound, smell, and taste. When we're in training, the lights are fluorescent. The sound, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of commotion. The smell, you want it to invoke comfort. Taste, bring food to a meeting if you want it to be productive. And touch, we want the training environment to be comfortable. We want people to dress down, and we want the chairs to be comfortable. My point is that what you want to do is you want to make the training environment comfortable so that you can make the conversations uncomfortable. It's similar to what Steve Jobs did every day by wearing black. He was focused on other things, not about fashion and what he was wearing, and I want the training environment to be just that. I worked at an organization called Scope, and I have some Scope members here today in the audience. And Scope was an office that was an innovation cell at NGA, and it was unique because there was about 50 people who worked in a room with whiteboards, and we had positive conflict. We would argue. I was cursed at one point, but then we would go to lunch together, and then we would be social after work. And what would happen is the best idea would win, and we would solve the problem. That type of training environment is the type of environment where people grow. And when I was at Scope, that was 13, 14 years ago, and it changed who I am, and it made a difference in my life. And I think that people need to be in those environments. So again, if the environment is comfortable, people can focus and put the... Is that me? Put them in the right frame of mind. Okay, 4. There's 4 student types. You'll meet people who want to get right to the results, and those are the people who have probably already gotten up and walked away from our panel today because they just want to get to the bottom line. Then there's other students who want a story and case studies, others who want statistics and data, and hold on because I have some. And then there's other people who just want you to stay on track, provide a framework and a schedule. And most training covers all 4, but it washes out. 3, learning styles. There's 3 learning styles, as you guys might know. There's visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And kinesthetic is the red-headed stepchild. NGA is visual. I am visual, and my secondary is kinesthetic. If you don't know what kinesthetic is, it's movement. So if you see someone doodling or making notes, that's them processing information. So don't stop them. If they get up and walk around, or they need to rock, or even if they're taking excessive notes, that's them processing the information that you're providing. And I don't get offended if you look down at your phone because you're still thinking and you're still listening. In the industry, we use standing desks. We use standing desks because it allows our employees to process and think about information while standing and moving. And I think that NGA, they could use that. They could take that into consideration. There's a 75% retention rate if kinesthetics are involved in training. There's your statistic. Number 2, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we're on 2. What I think we need to do is 2 classes for every topic. We need to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I want to do 15-minute classes. I don't want people to be in class for a few months. I think that's crazy. In industry, we don't have time for that, and we certainly can't afford that. So if I'm up here to provide the industry perspective, what I want to do and what I do in my practice is I introduce an idea, I have a 15-minute meeting. The student or the person or the employee walks away, they think about it. We come back a week later, we have another 15-minute meeting. They've taken an entire week to think about whatever the topic was, to go and seek outside resources, learn, watch some videos, Google it, YouTube it, whatever they need to do. And then they come back a week later and we discuss it and we introduce a new topic. But I said it kills 2 birds with 1 stone. The second bird, which this is a terrible analogy, but the poor bird, the second poor bird, is when the student leaves the 15-minute session and they go back into the office, what happens is they talk to the people in their pod. They have their discussion, they learn something new, they go back to the pod and they talk about it. And there's actually a 90% retention rate on data and information if they're teaching. So what I'm saying is that the students are become teachers. Number 1, I think we need to simplify things. My personal take on training is knowledge transfer, which is a ratio of 1 to 1. And one idea that I had that I think is scalable, even if 1 to 1 is not scalable, is 1 email a day. I think that we should be introducing 1 new email a day that has a 2-minute video on a new topic, whether it's HR, workforce, industrial psychology, whether it's a technical skill. We can sit there and watch a 2-minute video and we can learn something new and we can share that with the people in our pod, and this builds unity and connectiveness and it trains. It gets the conversation away from the football game to something that's work-related. So my key points are that we should customize it to the audience. We should use every opportunity to train. We need to democratize training, and we need to make students teachers. The atmosphere needs to be uncomfortable so that the discussion can be uncomfortable and there's a focus on that. We need to explain why in the big picture, and we need to create opportunities for deep thinking. The continuous learning is a big part of our lives, and we need to continue with that. Thank you.
Fantastic. So before we get to the questions, and while I'm allowing a little time for more questions to come in from the audience, I was wondering if the panelists would want to react to anything they'd heard from a fellow panelist.
Well, so one thing, and this kind of struck me when we did our prep session from Julia's comments. And by the way, when she introduced herself by saying she's not the same as the other panelists, I don't know about you guys, but I thought of Michael Jackson in the beginning of Thriller, where he said, "I'm not like the other boys," and then he turned into a werewolf. So I'm just gonna be careful where I am when the sun sets tonight. But when she talked about retention, there's an individual that I would commend to all of you, and it's for training, but it's also for visualization and the presentation of geospatial data. There's at least one person here that I know knows him. His name is Nahum Gershon. He's at MITRE. He has a PhD in storytelling. And what he conveyed to this, and I met him back when Keith Alexander was a colonel at Fort Bragg. He introduced us to Nahum, who told us that nobody will remember anything unless there's an emotional content to it. So think about what all of you do in your government jobs or your industry jobs. Is there emotional content in what you do? That's hard in this business. You know, the briefings we get at NGA sometimes are dry as a bone. But I would just commend that, and he can show you empirically how that is true. So you've got to have a narrative, you've got to have a story. When Robert first got to the agency on his first day at NGA, he published a little 4-page slicky about consequences, which came from his previous job briefing the president, that if you don't make an emotional connection, it's not going to sink in. So I would just concur with Julia's points and commend that as an aspect that perhaps is underdeveloped in our business.
Okay. So I have some cards up here, and I'm going to try to pull out some themes. So Dan had talked about lifelong learning. And the essence of the questions are, how do we ensure that our instructors are up to date with the newest methodologies and technologies? And at the same time, how do we ensure students have the training they need when they need it if our current process tends to focus on the first 3 to 5 years of a career?
Thank you, Ellen. With respect to the first question of how do you keep subject matter expertise, I think in an age of fast-changing technology and tradecraft, the key is going to be to make sure that the instructor is not in the classroom for 3 to 5 years without having going back. So the instructors need to be out doing the job and then coming back and teaching. To some extent, Julia mentioned the 1-minute email, the concept that everybody can be a teacher here. If you have access to the technology, you can provide that one daily email of a 2-minute knowledge transfer event. That then you become the subject matter expert that can transfer the knowledge, right? So we have to enable everyone to be a teacher. But in particular, I would not assign people to a training role for the next 3 to 4 years. They would need to be back out constantly, keeping pace with the technology. And the second aspect had to do with, I guess, getting more people into training.
Well, do we focus too much on early career training, 3 to 5, rather than the lifelong learning?
Well, I would reject the premise in the sense that it appears to be asked as an either-or. I think we need to do both and, right? So we can't ignore the initial training because that's necessary, but then at the same time we cannot ignore what's needed through the lifelong career training. So we That's why I talk about we have to do things faster, better, and cheaper, because we cannot afford to add millions and millions and millions of dollars to the budget or have more classrooms. We have to figure out smarter ways to do it, but we need to emphasize both tracks.
Great. Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
The only thing that I would add is that when you're looking at your body of instructors, your instructors are not just instructors, they are also students. And it's the first thing about your culture that you need to put into them. If you have any instructors that you're in charge of, I used to have questions from the government. It's like, well, when your instructors aren't in class, what are they doing? It's like they're learning. They're learning small group instruction. Actually, they're getting certified on it. They're learning their subject matter. They're hanging out at the PMO office for DSIG so they can learn all the tools for that and the latest builds for them. They're constantly learning, doing research when they're not in class, and they have to have that mentality. It's like, oh, I'm an instructor, I know everything. You have to know 90% more than what you're actually instructing. So that has to be an active part of managing any kind of instructor, or even in the education body. They're constantly learning and reading and writing papers and things like that. We should hold our instructors to the same level.
All right. So this morning in his keynote address, Robert Cardillo talked about the art and the science and the art of geospatial information. And it struck me that when we were talking the human-machine interface kind of a discussion, there's a kind of a nexus there between the art and the science. How do we succeed and prepare people best to operate in that environment?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I think Todd Bakestow mentioned a little bit, it's kind of getting back to the basics, and Colin re-emphasized that, but it's helping people understand the fundamentals of the technology that they're working with. You have to understand the strengths of that technology as well as the limitations of it, and you need to understand how it processes data. You don't need to be the engineer that built it and understand every circuit inside of it, but you need to understand what it can do and what it cannot do, and you need to understand when it's failing. So you have to, the individual has to understand the machine well enough to understand when the machine is not going to be able to perform.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting how the different parts of this symposium are connected. And so the first thing I thought of when you asked that question is Scott Hartley's presentation this morning, the techie and the fuzzy, because I think that's the answer to your question, and Todd alluded to this, I think. You can't be so narrowly focused in your training that you're a specialist that you don't understand the rest of the world or the context that your specialty lies in. And I think the schoolhouse does this, both for technicians, but also for leaders to understand the technology that they're asking their subordinates to apply. So I think you've got to have that balance in your education and in your experiences, and I think that applies to both the instructors and the students, so that you get the gestalt. You're not myopic.
I think that you need subject matter experts on everything, but you also need people who are cross-functional players, and so I think there's a balance. That would be my comment.
So the introduction of more of a multidisciplinary kind of an approach?
Yeah, I think largely what I spoke about today was putting the right pieces together before you even start the training program, not necessarily about the content, but really about putting the right environment together for the people, and then when the content comes, you have the right people in the room to teach the content. So, I think a training program or knowledge transfer could be very well suited to someone who is coming in and out of that environment that is a subject matter expert, similar to Cardillo's speech today, right? So he has a cross-functional, he's in a leadership role, but he brought subject matter experts in to talk about their specific tradecraft. And so that was an opportunity to train. I learned something, And it was storytelling. We had facts and figures, and we ran through everything, and that was a complete knowledge transfer.
Fantastic.
You know, just one footnote. I think it bears repeating from Scott's brief. He said, "Education is a passport, not a plane ticket." That's one that I wrote down. I'm gonna take that with me. You know, one thing I'll share: the briefings we get at NGA on a daily basis. Robert has a practice. Anytime a new briefer briefs, they have to tell their story, and it's fascinating to me the breadth of the educational backgrounds that we get. You know, you get the geographers and the cartographers, but you get political scientists, you get anthropologists, you get mathematicians, you get English majors, and they all bring a breadth and a depth that I think is healthy for us.
Fantastic. And the last question for the panel, is there a generational component to this in terms of, as you're trying to think about knowledge and skill transfer, is it different for different populations? I know many of you have touched kind of on that, but I was wondering if you could expand.
I've had experience training kids who no longer know what 9/11 was, and they don't remember the date, and all the way up to folks that have been around for decades. I've watched my daughter study for her classes in high school, where she's got a laptop on her lap, she's got her phone that she's holding and reading it, and she's got Bob's Burgers playing in the background, and she's got music playing as well. The kids from the next generation, they can assimilate data faster than you or I ever could, and they can get it from multi-channels, and they can bring it all and absorb it all in. But in the consequence, they're losing the ability to do deep level driving down into data and driving into a particular subject matter. I go into my kids' high school twice a year and I teach military history, largely because the history department doesn't know military history. And I teach them an ancient battle in the fall, and I teach them Agincourt in the spring, but I do it using the techniques that I know the kids know how to learn. So I bring out a table full of miniatures because I'm a huge gamer, so I'll put it all on a table, and then I'll assign leaders and the kings, and you get a little card that says, this is you for the next hour and a half. You're going to determine whether you live or die or not, depending on whether you listen to the lecture. And these kids get into it so much that I now have groupies following me and eating lunch with me in the school, because they love to talk history and they want it presented as an immersive gaming environment that they understand. If I gave them to them in a straight lecture, I'd have them asleep and they wouldn't remember a thing. So it's not that we have to change the way the next generation is coming in on how they should work just like us. We can do that to a degree, but we do have to change the way on how they like to learn. And sadly, the industry that has figured it out is the gaming industry. When you used to buy a video game or whatever, you used to have a manual that comes with it. That is no longer the case. You learn the game by playing it and going through the tutorial levels or whatever, and once you get into the real complex part, they add more on to that. These kids know that and learn it, and can learn it faster than we ever could, but they don't read manuals and they don't do the standard ways of learning that you and I are used to.
I think that there's a strong pull to not want to let go of how things have always been. And I think that we do have a generational gap. Cardillo said today in his speech how important mindset is. And everything I said today is what I've learned in startups, really with the millennial generation. And so if we want to attract tech-savvy people into the workforce, we have to create the environment that they're going to be comfortable in and that they're going to want to work in. They have a choice of where they go work. And those kids can teach you things, and you can teach them things. And I guess I would argue that a more lean startup environment would be something that would attract them, and it could further NGA's agenda.
Fantastic. Well, guys, we're out of time. From the panel. I appreciate all the questions that came in from the audience, and I want to thank our panelists for being here today and giving us something to think about beyond just the traditional training, but rather about knowledge and skill transfer in the future in this fast-paced environment. Thanks so much.